It's good to be with you guys. Thank you so much for having me. We have an Exodus Cry booth down in the basement. You guys can get copies of this documentary we did on global sex trafficking if you'd like. But I brought a couple extras with me, a Blu-ray and a DVD. Does anybody want these ones? Yeah, first come, first serve. All right. I just don't want to hit anybody out there, so my aim isn't very good. I was in Cambodia when we were making this documentary, and I was on the outskirts of Phnom Penh, and we were in the back of a van and driving to a small village called Swaipak. I had my film crew with me, and we were meandering through various streets and getting further and further, seemingly from civilization. He says, you know, there's a brothel over there, there's a brothel over there. And they just look like dilapidated shacks, and it's nothing but Cambodians, you know, around, and so the van kind of pulls up to a stop. The dust settles around the van, and I look over to my right, and there's one of these brothels, and there's a man outside, a heavy-set Western man, who stuck out like a sore thumb. I thought, man, they really exist. Like these men that come to buy children for sex. It was so mind-blowing. But there he was, bartering for sex with a child. So I get out the van, and just instinctively, I start walking towards him. I'm not even thinking that my film crew is, you know, probably wondering what they're supposed to do. So they're like, hey, what do we do? I go, well, just follow me. And so we start walking towards this guy. Well, he sees us coming, and so he kind of, you know, like starts to kind of slowly walk away. He starts walking up the alleyway, and so, you know, we're just walking after him, and then he kind of does a couple of these, you know, and sees this, you know, small band of people following after him, so he breaks into a full sprint. So then I start sprinting, and then my camera crew starts sprinting. So, you know, so much for keeping a low profile, but we find ourselves chasing this guy through the streets of Swaipak out to the main highway, where he jumps on the back of a moped taxi. The thing is literally taking off, and I grab him, and I yank him back by the collar of his shirt, and suddenly find myself face to face with a man who had come and flown halfway across the world to buy a child for sex. And I hadn't even thought that far ahead. I didn't even know what to do in that moment. I'm holding this guy, and I'm literally face to face with him, and everything that I had seen in that show 24, Jack Bauer, you know, was coming through one part of my brain. And the other part of my brain was, you know, connecting with this man's brokenness. And it was such a strange cocktail of emotions and feelings that I had at that moment. I remember just shaking him and yelling at him and saying, don't ever come back to this town again. And what do you do? You know, thank you. What do you do? You know, it was a strange situation to be in. But I remember, you know, leaving that situation and beginning to ponder this idea of you know, this man's life and how did he wind up in this situation? And I remember the moment of recalling and thinking and discovering just in my own process this idea that a man does not suddenly wake up one day and decide he's going to go fly halfway across the world to buy a child for sex. Something happened. There was a cultivation and a progression and an acceleration and a development of appetites in this man's life that brought him to this point. And so we continued our travels. We traveled to 4 continents, 19 countries, and 42 cities, documenting the phenomenon of global sex trafficking. And everywhere we went, there were droves and droves of men lining up to purchase women and children for sex in red light districts all over the world. And we discovered the phenomenon that is the demand for commercial sex. In Germany, there are 1.5 million purchases of sex per day. In Spain, 1.5 million purchases of sex per day. In Israel, a very small country with a relatively small population, 1 million purchases of sex per month in Israel. And so what we're talking about is a cultural phenomenon. We came to this realization that these men are not a few bad apples on the fringes of society. There is something else going on, that the subterranean movements of a trajectory sending large demographics of men into the commercial sex industry and fueling this global phenomenon of sex trafficking. And so we began to ponder this question: what kind of society is producing so many men willing to buy a woman or child for sex? I just want you to, thank you. I just want us to ponder that question for a moment. What kind of society is producing so many men willing to buy a woman or child for sex? Doing the math on this issue of commercial sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, is not that difficult. If men stopped buying women and children for sex, we would see an end to sex trafficking today. The entire commercial sex industry would implode, and we would see the largest exodus of human beings from systemic oppression that the world has ever seen before. And so I'm not saying that as an indictment to shame all men. I know that we as men can be sensitive about these things. We learned that when the Gillette commercial came out. But I'm just in a very kind of, because, and I is a man, so, it doesn't benefit me to shame all men. What I'm doing is just purely doing the math on 1 + 1 = 2, and all this boils down to is this issue of demand. And so we have to ponder this question of what kind of society is producing so many men willing to buy a woman or child for sex. Now, I'm just going to cheat and give you the easy answer, and then I'm just going to spend a few minutes, 17 minutes and 5 seconds to be precise, kind of bringing you up to this statement. But I'm going to get way ahead of myself, and if you're taking notes, I just want you to remember this one thing to answer that question. The kind of society that is producing so many men willing to buy a woman or a child for sex is a pornographic culture. And when I say a pornographic culture, I'm not saying that through some kind of Christian moralist lens that is meant to just, in a broad, sweeping kind of way, shame, pornography, and whatever. Maybe there's some value in that. I'm saying that phrase in a very technical way. And here's what I mean when I say a pornographic culture. When I say pornographic culture, I'm talking about a culture that casts men as sexual predators, that casts women as sexual objects, and that casts sex as a meaningless recreational act. Those three things. And that is what we have seen transpire in the last 50, 60, 70 years, is the pornification of our society. The development of a society that casts men and women into these roles, and a society that has utterly desacralized sex, stripped it of all meaning. And which is odd, because in an age when it seems like sex is everywhere, and it seems like it is the god of our time, so to speak. If you think about, our God is the master passion of our life. I mean, sex is so glorified everywhere throughout our culture, and yet stripped of all meaning. And so that I'm just getting straight to the punch on this one. The kind of society that produces so many men willing to buy a woman or child for sex is a pornographic culture. Now, I just want to go back a little bit to kind of do the math and help you bring you up to speed on what has developed in our society and our world, so that we know how to form a resistance to it. And that so we know how to build a countercultural movement. Do you know that Christianity is an act of civil disobedience? That Jesus went about disrupting the hierarchy and narrative of his day to bring forth a message of the kingdom that was so disruptive to his time. And so I think it's important for us to develop an understanding of this so we can form a movement of resistance to it and a countercultural revolution. But the pornographic culture has a father, and his name is Hugh Hefner. In 1952, with the release of Playboy magazine, Hugh Hefner took pornography from the back street to the main street. He brought about the normalization of pornography in our society. Now, there are three things that happened during this time. He shifted the narrative about what it meant to be a man. He shifted the narrative about what it meant to be a woman. And he shifted the narrative about how society understands sex. So when you think about the big bang moment of porn culture, it was the release of Playboy magazine in December of 1952. It had no publication date on it, no publication number, because he had no idea if there would even be a second issue. But within weeks, they sold out all 52,000 copies, and within a few years, they had a subscriber base of 1 million people. So that was the big bang moment that set forth a trajectory. Now, I want to just talk real briefly about this, what happened related to the story of men, the story of women, and the story of sex since that time. So it's very important to understand this idea of socialization. Socialization is the process by which we internalize the stories of our culture in the development of our values, our worldview, our ethics, and our identity. And so the idea is that in a society that you tell certain stories, we tell stories as a society, and then as we grow up into pre-adolescence into adolescence and into adulthood, we begin to internalize those stories so we understand who we are in the world. And this is how society works. Culture does not fall fully formed from heaven. It is a result of the stories that we tell as a society, so it's important to understand these stories. Now, in the same year that Hugh Hefner released Playboy magazine, there was a movie that came out that was called It's a Wonderful Life. And this movie has a character in it, most of you guys have seen it, comes out around Christmas every year, Jimmy Stewart. And his character, he's pursuing the woman of his dreams, and he says, what do you want? He's like, I'll lasso the moon for you, and I'll pull it down. And you see his pursuit of this woman in kind of what would be considered a more traditional role, where you actually open doors for women and treat them with kindness and, buy flowers, those kinds of things. But the story embodies this traditional notion of manhood and masculinity where a man pursues a woman in love, builds a family, sacrifices for his community, remains faithful through the struggles of life. And what's interesting is that, this movie came out the same year that Playboy magazine was released, which ultimately brought about the death of this traditional notion of masculinity. And the lie that Hugh Hefner sold in the pages of Playboy magazine was very intentional. It wasn't just nude pictures of women. It was him in a smoking jacket lying around all day with a harem of women. He presented a new way of being a man in the world, one that is entitled to women and lots of women. And what we have seen is the shifting of the narrative since that time about what it means to be a man in our culture, to where today men gain masculine validation from their male peers based on the number of women that they can score or hook up with and how far they can get with those women. So we see this embodied in characters that come along, frequently through our culture. Some of you remember the Dos Equis man, the greatest man alive, or the most interesting man alive, or whatever it was, those beer commercials. And he's always surrounded by this older man surrounded by multiple young women, right? Again, presenting this idea about what it means to be a man as a user of women. This is in all the James Bond movies. James Bond embodies the apogee of male existence. Most boys grow up at one point or another announcing, introducing themselves as Nolo, Benjamin Nolo, because we get that from James Bond. All young boys grow up wanting to be James Bond, but he's a very sadistic picture of what it means to be a man. I remember seeing Skyfall, the most successful James Bond film of all time, when he's trying to track down the villain, and so he goes to this woman who he knows is connected to the villain to try and get to him through her. So they have this conversation, and she doesn't trust him. She's growing in fear and terror, and he grabs her and he says, "No." He turns over her hand. There's a marking. He goes, you've been a victim of the child sex trade. I will fight for you. I will rescue you. Trust me. That's the paraphrase of the conversation. She goes, if you really save me, out of this situation, I'll give you this information, but I could be killed. No, trust me. This is how the scene goes. Next scene, flash. She's in the shower. He just enters the shower unannounced. Here I am, naked, apparently that's what it looks like in a modern culture, to pursue a woman. Forget opening the door, just show up in the shower. And so then they do what they do, and then it transitions. The next scene, they're on this island, and the trafficker has captured them both. She's tied up over here. James Bond's walking with the villain guy. He's saying, I don't keep anything superfluous or redundant around in my life. And then the camera pans to this woman tied up over here. He goes, let's play a game. And he puts this glass of scotch on the woman's head. And he gives a gun to James Bond. And he goes, here, try and shoot the glass off the top of her head. So he gives the gun to James Bond, and you think in this scene he's going to take out the bad guy, rescue the girl, the drama's building. He actually shoots the gun and nearly misses her. I'm like, whoa, what's happening here? And then the bad guy takes the gun, and he lifts it up. And you think, okay, now's the moment. He's going to break in. The bad guy shoots her right in the head. She falls dead, and he turns to James Bond and goes, what do you think of that? He goes, I win. What do you think of that? James Bond goes, a waste of good scotch. And then he disarms the bad guy and saves himself. The message here is that real men aren't compassionate protectors of terrified and frightened victims of child sex trafficking, but use and exploit them for their own sexual self-gratification. And when given the opportunity to save these poor, vulnerable people, would rather let them die and save themselves. Beloved, these stories about manhood are throughout our culture, but we're so numbed by the overstimulation and excessive reliance on entertainment in our culture that we become completely dulled to the messages and the stories that are embedded all around us of this toxic nature that are cultivating and socializing our young boys into predatory users of women who end up buying and renting women's bodies in the sex industry, hence a $150 billion global sex trafficking industry. Are you guys tracking with me? Okay, there's so much to say about every single one of these points. And so I'm just giving you the high points, the low-hanging fruit, and hopefully you'll retain some of it. So the story of women, again, Hugh Hefner shifts the narrative about what it means to be a woman. I don't think that the 1950s were, necessarily a particularly great portrayal of what it meant to be a woman per se. But Hugh Hefner thrust the idea of what it meant to be a woman into a whole different stratosphere, and by objectifying women's sexuality. He brought about the industrialization of women's sexuality. He developed a business model that proved to be very successful at generating money by using the objectified female body. So the image of women coming into the culture, the dominant image of women coming into the culture was one of them in these sexually, scantily clad, objectified ways. And this began to get conflated with what it meant to be an empowered woman. And so then, as women began to internalize this story, there's been this idea that to be a real woman or to have value as a woman is to objectify your sexuality and to gain sex appeal. We see this in the most popular women's magazine of all time, Cosmo magazine. Right? It is the most popular women's magazine of all time, Cosmopolitan magazine. And there is a consistent image of women that are presented on the cover of that magazine every single month. It is the same type of image of a scantily clad, come hither look, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem if they were celebrating other aspects of what it meant to be a woman. Like, what about putting one of the 2 female Supreme Court justices on the front of Cosmopolitan, the most popular women's magazine of all time, or somebody excelling in business or athletics or politics or this or this or this or this or this or this or this. Instead, it's the one, so it's the single story that is so destructive. I remember talking to a young woman who was a sex trafficking victim at the age of 14. She had an older man say he wanted to be her boyfriend. She ran away with him. The first night, he puts her out on the street for sale on Atlantic City. And she's, this, teeny little 14-year-old girl out there in mini, he had the whole thing planned out, mini skirt, whatever. I'm listening to her story. I'm interviewing her. I just can't even fathom that. And I'm like, at 14 years old, I go, what was that like to be out there for sale on the first night that you think you're running away with the man of your dreams? And she goes, I felt empowered. I was like, what? She goes, no, I was groomed by my culture long before I was groomed by my trafficker. She goes, I thought because men wanted to buy me that I had value. It was just mind-blowing. So when we see women, large numbers of women cascading into the sex industry, part of it has to do with a projection of women's empowerment that looks like this objectified sexual being. There's a music video by Rihanna that I feel like that captures it. The main lyrics of this song say, it's all about stripper poles and dollar bills while she writhes around on a stripper pole throwing money in the air. This is the female icon of our generation that girls grow up dreaming to be like. And they are advertising the sex industry as a great way for a woman to get a job. I don't have time to go into the story of sex, but I'll just say this, that in 1967, with the Summer of Love, we saw a revolution, a sexual revolution, and not for the better, one that has completely desacralized and stripped sex of all meaning. So it's these confluence of things, the story of men, the story of women, the story of sex, that culminates in the explosion of the global commercial sex industry. So the question isn't even so much how could this issue be going on, but how could it not be going on? Last thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to show a trailer for a movie that we have a screening coming up for. I believe it's on March 4th? 10th. March 10th. We have a screening. So after Nefarious, I went and did this movie called Liberated, The New Sexual Revolution. I'm going to play that here in just 1 second, that trailer. And this year, this is available. Well, come to the screening. And then we're releasing a new documentary this year on the porn industry called Beyond Fantasy, so keep an eye out for that. But I want to just end with this last story. So a year and a half ago, I was invited to come and speak at the United Nations about this issue of the role that the culture plays in the construction, development of this global sex trafficking industry. Essentially, I was speaking about bringing about a death to porn culture, pulling it up by the roots. And I get back to my hotel that night after being at the United Nations, and I get a text message, and my friend says, hey, bro, did you see the news? Hugh Hefner just died. I am literally at the United Nations speaking to world leaders about bringing an end to porn culture. And I get back and while I'm speaking, the father of porn culture dies. I don't even know what to do with that. Yeah, I was like, whoa. But this I do know is that we have entered a new era, and it's time for the church to seize the gates of influence to bring about a shift. To bring a shift. There was a subterranean movement of a revolution that happened in the 1950s and 60s that brought us to today, but there's a new revolution starting called the anti-trafficking movement, called the abolition movement, and we are joining together to call forth the abolition of sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation around the world. Here, check out this trailer. Thanks, you guys.